You took a vacation, you changed clinics, maybe you even changed careers, and then burnout came back anyways. For a lot of vet pros, that's the part nobody talks about and nobody likes to talk about. Burnout doesn't leave just because you do. Welcome back to the Veterinary Business Podcast, where practice owners get the strategies that build stronger teams and stronger businesses. I'm your host for this session, Don Adeesha. It's great to have you here. Now, today I'm joined by Dr. Amber Parks. She's a board-certified veterinarian, former medical director and practice owner, and now the founder of the Stress and Burnout Coach. She spent over a decade inside the profession, and now she helps vet teams break the burnout cycle for good. We'll get into why burnout keeps coming back, the signs most owners miss, and how the customer is always right, thinking burns teams out anyways, and why self-care alone won't fix any of it. Now, this episode is sponsored by Echo Marketing, the team helping vet practice owners grow without grinding themselves down. That being said, welcome to the podcast, Dr. Parks.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Now let's get into it. Why does burnout often keep coming back for veterinary professionals even after they change jobs, clinics, or careers?
Yeah, I see this a lot in my coaching clients, and I experienced this myself. So I did a decade as an associate and medical director, and I got really burnt out. And I thought, if I just switch to relief work, then this will be the solution. And I was happier for a short period of time, but then the really cool part was I started going into all these practices and seeing people that were experiencing the same things I was experiencing. So I realized it doesn't matter where you're at. Certainly there's some practices, and just like any job, right? Some are better than others. But really what it came down to was the way that I was trying to process or manage the stress that we all deal with in a veterinary hospital every day. So things like, dealing with clients, maybe emotionally charged clients, maybe coworkers or colleagues that just have really, challenging personalities. And that is everywhere you go. That is even outside of our profession. So I even worked with a coaching client of mine. She was a veterinarian. She left clinical practice to go to academia. And that's when her and I connected. And she's like, I'm so burnt out still. So she was a great example. We worked together. She actually went back into clinical practice, and she realized it's not, yes, there's the sad cases, like you're removed from that, but it comes down to learning how to process the stress instead of just completely trying to push it away and act like it didn't happen, which usually catches up with us.
So are we unintentionally training ourselves to thrive on chaos, making it difficult for the nervous system to actually settle into a healthy environment?
Yeah, I think we've all been living that way, right? So the way that many of us have got to where we are in our careers, whether that's a support staff member, that's a veterinarian, we have probably sacrificed a lot, worked very hard. We probably have some perfectionist tendencies, and we just keep pushing through, which is great to get us to where we are. But that is not the same recipe that will sustain us in practice and in our career. So yeah, I think that we always, live in fight or flight without really realizing it. You're just kind of like, well, I got today and tomorrow, then I'm off for the weekend and it'll be better, next week. And we just push through, and then next week comes and it's a repeat of the same thing. So yeah, we're always in that type of energy. And when you really dig down deep, the things that we're experienced and exposed to every day just kind of irritate, but there's this wound that's there. And being comfortable without having to always do something, I have found, is a lot of what I see in the people in veterinary medicine too.
So it's possible for this irritation to go away. Is that what you're saying? And for us to really find some more healing or meaningful aspect to it instead?
Yeah, it's, again, we are in healthcare, which is never 100%, but we put that on ourselves to be 100%. So there's always going to be a disconnect there. And yeah, I think we can absolutely find our passion back in the profession in practice when we learn to manage some of that stress instead of, like I did, trying to avoid it and go to different practices and then realizing, you know what? Yes, there's a system of veterinary medicine that I think has a lot of opportunity for fixing, but I can start today on how I'm experiencing and dealing with that stress and get relief and be able to have a sustainable career.
Check. Now, what are some of the signs that a veterinary professional is dealing with chronic stress rather than just being tired or overworked?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. So I was burnt out for years and I didn't know it. Okay. So really the big difference is, do you have that ability to recuperate? So short stress, like we know just physiologically, is normal and okay, but that's when we can get back to baseline and be like, okay, I'm not in that fight or flight energy. I'm good. The chronic stress that turns into burnout is this, it doesn't matter if I take a vacation, if I switch jobs, I'm so exhausted that even rest doesn't touch it. A lot of times what I find is people will work really hard throughout the week. Maybe they're off on the weekend. They just sit there like a lump on the log, scrolling on their phone because they're too tired to do anything. But then they feel guilty that they're not doing something. And then they, finish out the weekend and then they have to start it all over again. So there's never really a mental break. And that's the biggest difference I find is like, can you get back to baseline? And many of us, I think, can't, or we're not aware that we should be able to do that.
So exhausted being the symptom. I'm just wondering, how can we really identify that when we are in that position?
Yeah. So I experienced this, but there a lot of resentment. So I almost had resentment towards the profession, to clients, even anger at times, because I'm looking at my schedule like, okay, this won't be too bad. I can get through it. And then like 2 things get added on. And then I'm like spiraling and angry. So there's that piece. And it's anger of like things that really should just be a little speed bump along the way, end up feeling like a mountain. And that's a thing that I see a lot, is that cynicism. Like, I like to have fun in practice. I like to laugh. I'm all for that. But this is like that doom and gloom. It doesn't matter what comes in. You're just constantly miserable. Yeah, that's going to be a sure sign that we need to start looking a little bit deeper.
Okay. And now let's talk a little bit about neurodivergence. How does neurodivergence show up in a veterinary medicine, and why can it increase the risk of burnout?
Yeah, so this is a personal obsession, if you will, for me. I was late diagnosed at 42 years of age, ADHD and autistic. And I was shocked, first of all, like, how did I get through undergrad and vet school and a decade and a half of practice? And then when I learned more in depth, I'm like, oh, I think there's a lot of us in this profession that, especially my age group, like when I was younger, I wasn't a rambunctious kid. I sat in school really quiet. I got really good grades, but the ADHD part of that was in my brain. It was the overactive overthinking, which I think anyone in this profession, we can easily identify with that. But we also have challenges too, I think, with communication sometimes, or, there's varying degrees on the spectrum of this. Some is easier than others. And what's interesting is I also think many of us have an affinity for animals, because maybe it was hard to communicate with humans. So we naturally went to animals. We maybe went to veterinary school or some schooling, came out and realized, oh, the animals are attached to humans. Now I have to really foster that relationship. So we end up really putting on, they call it masking, where we tend to people please. We tend to put this outward persona of maybe not who we are, but what people expect us to be. And I did this for years and I didn't know what it was, but it was also why I got home from a day of work and was exhausted and couldn't get off the couch. So I think it just sets us up for burnout, even more so if we go undiagnosed too.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So really neurodivergence shows up in veterinary medicine if we are having some kind of challenges with communication, probably not just some, right? Chronic challenges with communications, basically. Would you?
Yeah, a lot of it too. So I know this will resonate with your listeners. I didn't know this, but things like perfectionism, the all or nothing thinking, we think of all maybe the less desirable things, but the good part is we tend to be out of the box thinkers. We do really well in chaos and high stakes. And so that is also why I think we have a lot of people in veterinary medicine, right? It takes a certain person to do that. But yeah, I think we tend to be very empathetic. And so when we're facing all the challenges that we do on a normal day in veterinary medicine, we're feeling everyone's energy, we're absorbing that, and that gets very draining. And if we're not aware of that, and then if there is some communication challenge, it just kind of layers all these possibilities together to really, potentially stack the odds against us and set us up for burnout for sure.
Right. I'm just wondering now with regards to masking, right? Is that also multiplied because of these communication challenges, or is that something more different?
It's more, I would say it's a little bit different. Now, the interesting part though, is this looks different for everyone. And I think that's what makes it challenging to identify it. And what makes this look different for everyone is our personalities, essentially. So the communication piece was interesting because I still don't really identify with that. I think I do a pretty good job of talking to clients, but I noticed that I'm almost hyper fixated. Like you're having a conversation with someone, you're reading all the non-verbal body language because maybe you trained yourself over years, and this happens many times in girls and women. We've trained ourselves to subconsciously pick up on those things and not realize it. But in doing that, that takes energy as well. So it comes off as we communicate no problem, but it can really drain a lot of energy in doing that.
That's really interesting. I would think you're a next level communicator, right?
Yeah. And that's what I liked communicating, honestly, with clients. If you get that great client who wants to be educated, they want to hear about everything. And, and I enjoyed the medicine aspect of it too at that point. So in my mind, that didn't even cross my thought of this might be a drain of energy. It was it's all or nothing. We give it all, and that's really why, if we're not aware of that, that's why I think had I known I was neurodivergent, I think I would have been more aware of that. I just thought I need more sleep, but that didn't even do it either. So, yeah.
That's amazing. So it can definitely lead to a risk of burnout because you're just not aware of it, what you're doing. You might be masking, you might be having some other challenges that aren't being addressed in the typical sense of communication training and all the other continuing education opportunities. So yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Parks, for really sharing that experience, insight with us. Now, we've been talking about cycles that keep coming back, patterns that don't fix themselves with a vacation, a new job, or one more wellness app. The same thing happens with practice growth. Most clinics don't lose growth in one big moment. It happens quietly. You try a new ad platform, you redo the website, you hire another tech, but the problem keeps growing, but not the practice. Because the issue isn't tactical, it's strategic. And that's exactly why EcoMarketing built the complimentary marketing strategy meeting. Think of it less like a marketing call and more like a diagnostic of your practice. You'll sit down with Lila, a veterinary marketing strategist who has worked with hundreds of clinics, and together you'll look at what your marketing is actually telling you. What's bringing in new clients, what's really costing you, and where the leaks in your client journey are. And what a focused 6-month growth plan could look like for your clinic, your market, and of course, your goals. So no more guessing, no more piling on tools and budget without clarity. You walk away knowing exactly where to focus next so the cycle can finally break. Book your complimentary marketing strategy meeting at veterinarybusinessinstitute.com/MSM. I'm going to repeat that one more time. Veterinary Business Institute, that's one word, .com/MSM. Echo only takes a limited number of meetings each month. So if this resonated with you, go ahead and grab a spot while it's open. All right, let's get back into the conversation because the next question takes this even deeper. Dr. Parks, in what way does the traditional customer service mindset contribute to burnout in veterinary teams?
So this is an interesting perspective that I think we just take for granted. I don't know if it's the right term, but we just assume this is how it is. And so what I mean by that is, we are a unique situation where we're obviously healthcare, but we're in a state where people pay out of pocket. I mean, even if they have insurance, they typically pay first and get reimbursed. And so I think that brings us to a different level of expectations on what clients should receive and how they should receive it. So we're taking something that is healthcare, which we all know is not 100%, and it never will be, and we're human. And then almost business model in a way that is trying to produce a product or a service. So yeah, it may work many times, but there are going to be times where there's a disconnect. And I think that that's where we can lose some people when it comes to burnout. What I mean by that too is some of my coaching clients that I work with that are veterinarians, they feel like, well, I had this client that was maybe really rude or disrespectful, and I have to see them again. Or they didn't fire them, the clinic manager or owner or whomever didn't fire them, and now I have to be subjected to seeing them again. And so kind of we worked through what that looks like and how to make that so you don't feel like you're a doormat. But it's that simple concept that I think have always put us on, well, I don't want to say this, but the customer is always right. I think I think that mindset is changing a lot. And I think that's very empowering. And I also think that will allow a lot of our support staff and doctors to want to stay in those practices that support them and don't allow them, as in the employees, to be second rate to the customers too. So, does it cause it directly? No, but yeah, it's a business, right? We have to look at the bottom line, but are we doing that to the detriment of our employees is the big question.
So what does a healthy boundary first kind of customer service model look like in a high volume clinic?
I think it's going to look different for everyone because everyone's threshold of what they can handle as far as busyness, energy level, chaos is going to be a little bit different. But you have to, I think we're really good at not even knowing what our boundary is, right? We're just like, we don't need a boundary. We don't have it. So no one's going to listen to me. So I'm just going to keep going. And we end up doing things or having to, see clients that don't really like us and we don't feel great about it. Like that's really just not a great partnership, as it is. So it can be challenging as far as like where to set those boundaries. Number one, it's you as an individual and you have to set that and people will test you and, you have to walk them through that process of like, no, this is where I'm at. So I think it's going to look different for everyone, but I think we forget bottom line is that you can have boundaries. Even though you're an employee, you're still human. And I think a lot of times we think we're either going to get in trouble or lose our job. So we don't speak up, but we're miserable inside and that can fester.
So really take ownership of that boundary yourself. And what if the practice owner wants to help, right? Wants to support, but they're not aware of that the associate is facing such criticism from clients and they're keeping it bottled up because they're afraid of, bringing it up and seeming a bit too sensitive.
Yeah. So I live this. I'll tell you my story in a nutshell. When I was a medical director, we hired on a newer doctor and she's still there actually. She's phenomenal. And I remember one of our first doctor meetings, well, it wasn't the first, she had been there a little bit of time, but she had experienced a client that wasn't happy with her. And the irony is this client just cycled through the doctors of who they weren't happy with. So it was going to be my turn next at some point. And I remember her telling the practice owner, who is a phenomenal guy, and she's like, and she just asked it in the nicest, sweetest way. Like, I saw these people, I really don't feel comfortable seeing them again with what they said to me and what they said about me. And I remember thinking, I've done a total 180. I remember thinking like, just do it. Like, just go in the room. Like, it sucks, but this is work. Like, just, it was that mentality of just keep pushing through. And it was so well received by my boss. And he was like, absolutely, like, I'll see them or whatever it is. So having that psychological safety to be able to bring that up and not have judgment. Thank God I wasn't the one that was, because not that I would have said, oh, you need to just whatever, but I know there are a lot of practices out there that still have that mentality. So my biggest lesson for that was, one, you have to set a boundary and bring it up yourself, which could be the hardest part, but no one is going to do it for you. But two, for practice owners, if you sense something like that might be going on, I think it's a great thing to have, in a private setting, a very honest question of like, hey, how did it go with so-and-so? Was that, I know they were really challenging, and just a very open-ended question, because what might come out of that is the fruit of what you're looking for to have that conversation too.
Amazing. Absolutely. I think, as you mentioned, Dr. Parks, usually it's not well received, such feedback. Well, I wouldn't say usually, because, in the veterinary professional, everyone involved is so compassionate. Like the amount of people that I have met through my own time in the industry. So it just might me, the practice owner isn't aware that such thing is going on. Majority of the time, that might be the case. So bringing it up nicely, setting the boundaries for yourself first is so key, as you aptly showed in that example. Thank you so much, Dr. Parks. Now, why isn't self-care alone enough to heal this burnout that we've been discussing? And what are some of the deeper changes that are needed at both a personal and a practice level to really root it out?
Yeah. So self-care, I think the notion was from a real positive place. Like, let's find this, self-care. Let's present this as a solution, because then we get a break from the chaos of practice, and that will help with burnout. And as I started to experience burnout myself and dig deeper, I'm like, this is just a pause in the chaos. I can go get a massage, go for a walk, be with my dog in nature, and that's great. But I need to know how to handle, a challenging coworker or a client or my inner self of imposter syndrome. Like, there's no amount of self-care that is going to be that solution. So to get to the root of it, truly, I do think working with someone that understands the profession, a coach like myself, because we can't see our own blind spots. Like, I have a coach as well. I can't see my own blind spots or what stories I've been telling myself probably my entire life. So to have someone else reflect that back is how we identify, this might be a deeper pattern here, and then, root that out. Some of the work that I do with my coaching clients is getting down to the subconscious patterns, which are so interesting because there's a lot here that we are not aware of, but drives a lot of our decisions and our, mentality of, sorry, a cat on a veterinary podcast here.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So the subconscious is very interesting because a lot of these patterns we developed in childhood. So this is where perfectionism can come from, because maybe our parents were like, well, you got a B plus, but it wasn't an A. And it may have been from a very benign place, but our little brains are like sponges. And we thought, oh, if we work harder, then my parents are happy. Then we start all these patterns of perfectionism and people pleasing. So it's really getting to the root of that. As far as for practice owners, I think I love to have these open conversations on a one-on-one basis. That's where you're going to get the most honest answer. And a lot of the stuff that happens before a conversation like that is to just have that psychological safety, have that, if I tell my boss this thing, are they going to freak out and, go off on the deep end, right? So we know those type of people, we may have worked with them. It's not having that type of reaction that opens your office door, if you will, to have people feel more comfortable to be able to have those conversations. And that's really like the basis of that. And I think when we can normalize some of these conversations too, it doesn't feel this taboo topic of, we all know burnout exists, but I've had people that have told me they've gone to job interviews and they were asked, oh, there's a gap in your resume. Can you tell us about that? And they're like, oh, I was really burnt out. And the interviewer said, yeah, maybe don't tell anyone that, because then that's not going to look really good for you. So that happened to someone I know. And I'm thinking, we all know it exists. Why are we're still trying to cover it up? So normalizing the conversation, not just in your practice, but in the profession itself.
So I know, as you mentioned, we really tend to tiptoe around the conversation, as well as there's the other party that says we need to speak a lot more about burnout as well. So it's an interesting dichotomy right there. Yeah. But Dr. Parks, I'm just curious. So we began with really identifying or diagnosing what really can look like burnout, that being exhausted, always being exhausted, and just not knowing how to manage these situations, these relationships with clients, customers. So what do you mean by that? How can we, step out? What does this ideal managing looks like for you as a recovering burnout?
Yeah. I know for myself, and I see this with a lot of people, is we just have to get recognition of really what is going on for ourselves first, because it's very easy. I was there myself to get into the victim mindset of this profession is, insert whatever adjective you want. And we just sit in this place and we stay stuck because we're miserable. But getting curious and asking yourself, well, what is so bad about this? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's, whatever it is for you. Maybe it's the clients. All right, what about the clients is so miserable? Oh, they're draining. They ask me all these questions. Like, we just start to go a lot deeper. And when we're able to do that, I think then we can really identify where do we need to put our focus to then put prevention, for burnout for ourselves.
Check. And that's the path to sustainability, is it?
Yeah. Yep. And that's why there really isn't a cookie cutter way to do this. It is going to look different for everyone. I do see a lot of patterns in some of my coaching clients and myself too. But yeah, this isn't, I think there's a lot of good intention out there of wellness, talks and webinars, and that's great. But many of us, we leave that talk and we're right back to our patterns because that's all we know and that's what's familiar. So just getting curious on what truly is like triggering you, that's where we can start changing, the focus.
Fixing patterns requires solutions on a systematic scale. So, I was just curious, when you are in that mode of resentment towards the profession, when you were, right? How are you going to start identifying, what is it about, this client that I'm not really looking forward to, what is it about this new 2 more appointments that just got scheduled on that is just so annoying or even... Yeah. So how are you going to start identifying when you are that deep in the hole?
It sounds really simple, but ask yourself why and just keep asking that. So maybe not in the moment, right? If we're really stressed, I always tell people, like, we still have to process and deal with it. But if we're just trying to get through the day, then we just try to get through the day. But reflecting back, all right, I was really frustrated when those 2 appointments got put on the schedule. Why? Well, I'm tired. Okay, well, why is that? Well, it could go in any direction. Well, I was, worked yesterday for a colleague and that was usually my day off, or my spouse at home didn't help me with childcare. And so, insert whatever. Okay. And why is that? It's literally going through the analogy of like an onion. We're just peeling the layers and just keep asking yourself why. And you might be surprised because even though we're asking ourselves that, our brains love to answer questions. So the first thing that comes up when you ask yourself that is usually that deeper subconscious. That's really what is driving it. So that's kind of what you want to go with too.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. So start with why. And I feel like you mentioned there, scheduling some time for self-reflection at the end of the day, intentionally, and not just letting it be, one of those moments when you're just done and down in the dirt, and then you start thinking why, instead of having it more intentional. Would you recommend that?
Yeah, there's definitely a different energy to that, right? there's the venting, exhausted, miserable. Why am I doing this? And then we have to have have an ounce of compassion that you give your patients, because I think, like you said, we all are very compassionate people, but the last person we have compassion for is ourselves. And so we get upset of, why did I get mad? I shouldn't have been, or why did they put that on the schedule? I think the self-reflection is important. I like to tell my coaching clients that if you get home from work and you feel like there's a million things going on in your head, just write down. You don't have to solve anything, but our brains tend to like stay on a loop of a topic or that overthinking, because part of it is like, we don't want to forget this and we keep thinking about it. So writing it down physically can help with that. And we don't have to necessarily go back right then and there that day. But at some point, really, it's actually interesting. Once we leave the stress of the situation, we might have a totally different view of that. And so that can be really helpful too.
That's right. Let's start breaking that loop and, write things down, getting it out of our heads, exploring the why you were irritated with, a new appointment, really digging deep and finding those patterns and figuring out how to fix them on a systemic scale. I really appreciate this, Dr. Parks. It has been an amazing conversation. So before we wrap things out, I would love to get a key takeaway from you, or perhaps the golden nugget of our conversation. What would it be?
Yeah, the biggest thing I'd want your listeners to take away is you truly have a lot more in your power than you think you do. Even if you're don't own a practice, you're an associate or you're support staff member, we often have the approach that, well, because I'm not in management or I'm not an owner, I can't change any of this. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So it's hard to see it when we're in the muck, but that is so empowering, because then we can change how we experience things and how we process and experience that stress is the hugest piece to take away from that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Parks. So here's something that stuck with me throughout this conversation. Burnout isn't a personal failure. It's a pattern, and patterns don't break with a vacation, a new job, or a bubble bath, although we really wish it would. They break out when something deeper changes at the practice level, at the leadership level, and of course, inside how we think about the work itself. For practice owners, that matters, because a burned out team costs you retention, it'll cost you your culture, and of course, it'll cost you the energy to grow. Big thanks goes out to Dr. Amber Parks for the honesty and clarity she brought out today. Dr. Parks, where can our listeners get in touch with you if they are interested in?
Yeah, so I'm mostly on Instagram. My handle is at Dr. for doctor, period, Amber Parks, AMBERPARKS. And you can also check out my website, thestressandburnoutcoach.com. And if you're interested, like, what is this coaching thing and what does that look like? Just head over there, send me a DM or an email, and I'd love to chat.
Amazing. So if you want to build a practice that's run strong without running your team to the ground, that'll also start with strategy, not more hours. So go ahead and book that free marketing strategy meeting at veterinarybusinessinstitute.com/MSM. I'll repeat that one more time, veterinarybusinessinstitute.com/MSM for if growth is on your radar for 2026. Now, it has been my pleasure and privilege to host this podcast. I'm Don Adeesha. This has been the Veterinary Business Podcast. Until next time, take care.